If you're struggling to start your journey with God, or if you're already on a journey but you're struggling to see progress in your faith walk, then watch this video. My name is Celicia Renee. Welcome back to my channel. This is where I share with you about life lessons, finance and business, and spirituality. Today I'll be talking about some of the struggles that I've faced in my faith walk and how God started transforming me out of this harsh, judgmental life of religion into the freedom of having a grace-based relationship with Him. Some people might be saying, hey, what exactly is a grace-based relationship with God? It's literally the reason why Christ came and died for us. This is something that I've grown to understand more than it being a subject. It's grace, who is Christ Himself. It's not a popular topic because people are still trying to unlearn some of the things that religion has taught us through the years that's causing us to stay in bondage rather than live a life of freedom, which God intended us to live. So once Christ died and raised again, we were switched over from this old covenant or agreement, which is the law of Moses, into this new agreement of God's loving grace. This is where God expresses His unconditional love for us, and He accepts us with all of our flaws. And because it's a free gift, there's nothing we can do to ever earn or deserve this grace. There's no sin so great that grace can't cover it, and that forgiveness is not in place for. For a long time, I struggled to understand how grace was supposed to look in my everyday living. Even now, 22 years into my faith walk, I'm still unlearning things that tied me to religion. I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist, and that's a religion that is rooted in Old Testament law. And so we observed on the Sabbath, and that was from sunset Friday until sunset Saturday. On the Sabbath, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't do any form of work. You couldn't cook. You couldn't clean. Your focus was only on rest and worship. You couldn't do any chores. There was no TV. You couldn't clean. You were forbidden from wearing makeup as a woman, jewelry of any kind, except for perhaps like a wedding band. And you weren't allowed to have piercings or tattoos. You couldn't eat pork or shellfish. Women couldn't even wear pants in the church. You couldn't celebrate Easter or Christmas. If a woman was to have a baby without being married, she was pretty much ostracized and excluded from socializing with anyone else in the congregation. So needless to say, this was a pretty harsh or very strict religion to maintain. So around age 11, 12, I experienced church hurt. I went to this Adventist church. I was living in Florida at the time. It was close by the house. At the time I was in junior high school, and I had invited a few friends, including this boy that I liked. We had a little crush on each other. We're young, 11, 12 years old. So one of the girls that I invited decided to invite her cousin, and her cousin ends up liking the same boy. I didn't know that. And so she decides to come to church and fight me on church grounds. Crazy. So because I'm considered the member and she was a visitor, I got reprimanded. So I'm called into the elder's office, and I was told I should be ashamed of myself. I'm being put on probation. I wasn't able to participate in any of the youth ministry activities, and I wasn't allowed to sit with or talk to any of my friends at church. Talk about a harsh punishment for someone that's so young, that don't understand certain things, and something that wasn't my fault to begin with. Because I was isolated for however many weeks, I eventually just stopped going, and I just never went back to church after that. Fast forward to age 18. I had an apartment with my boyfriend at the time. We also worked at the same salon. He was a barber. I was a stylist. A close friend of his that also worked there as a barber. He comes into the salon one day and he was like, hey, we got to go to this meeting. So he convinces us to go to this meeting with him. And man, it was so wild. What they did was pull some scriptures from the Bible, and then they asked some questions to stimulate curiosity. And then based on the way they posed a question, it would get people's mind kind of going. Then they use this concept from their beliefs to answer the question, and that will reel people into their beliefs, right? It was pretty much a Black nationalist cult, and they use the Bible as bait to draw people in, and then they use a mixture of Islamic and ancient Egyptian practices to teach from. And so they introduced different gods in these meetings. We were learning things like hieroglyphics and other elements of their practices. Christ was extracted from absolutely everything, and I just knew something was wrong with this. I was just like, this is off, I just knew this was not God. And so the more we went, the more I knew this was wrong. And the more he went, the further we pulled apart. And it was really by God's grace that he pulled me out of that situation. Like, that could have went very wrong very quickly. I never went back to any of the meetings, and eventually our relationship broke up. And so clearly I was on this search, but I didn't trust anyone that easily because, I had this church hurt that happened to me very young. And it was pretty traumatic for me how young I was. I didn't realize at that point, but God had already put something in me that I wasn't just going to go along with anything. It was just a feeling in my gut. And I know that now to be discernment. And so that's God's grace showing up. So fast forward to age 21, I'm in this amazing relationship. I'm engaged to be married. And at this point, my wedding is like 7 months away. So we're in the middle of planning our wedding and finalizing things. And something shifted. Like, I started to feel this void that I didn't understand. I started getting angry for the simplest things. And I was just like, what is going on? Basically, it started affecting my relationship. This guy was like my best friend, and the relationship had a pureness to it. Even in our disagreements, we had so much respect for each other as young as we were. And so when this void showed up and this anger was showing up, I couldn't understand what it could possibly be, because in my mind, I had everything that I wanted. So where is this anger and stuff coming from, And so it started taking a toll on the relationship. I told him, I don't know what this is. I just feel this void. I feel this emptiness, and I can't explain it. Little did I know, this was a point in which that absence of God started to affect me in my life. And the anger I was feeling was traumas that were surfacing in my life, but they weren't clear yet. I didn't understand that then. I understand it now looking back. But this is the point where God's grace started coming in and teaching me things before I accepted Christ, before I became born again. You know what I mean? I really didn't know what to do. And that led him to feeling helpless and basically coming to me and saying, I don't know what you're going through and I don't know how to help you with this, but whatever it is, this is something that you have to do by yourself with God. And part of me couldn't understand why he would just want to walk away. But looking back, I understand we weren't mature enough to handle the heaviness that came with this. And so I was devastated. The heartbreak was unbearable, something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I literally felt pain. Anyone that has gone through heartbreak know that you literally feel pain in your body from the trauma. So in this brokenness, this is the point in which I just cried out to God, and God came in and just started dealing with me. And that became the beginning of this journey, which I now call my grace-based relationship with God. Fast forward to age 23, I met my ex-husband, and this was the first experience I had with a man that was already in a relationship with God. And it was a strong relationship, at least seemingly so to me, because I was still very much in my first couple of years of learning how to walk this new relationship with God. His relationship with God was what was the attraction factor for me. By the time we fast forward and he proposed, I didn't see a reason not to be married to him. And so I'll have to share further of the details of that story in a different video. But for the sake of this video, there were some fundamental things that I learned in that marriage that pushed me forward in my journey as far as growing in God. I found my church home in Florida, which I was at for 13 years. I learned my authority as a believer in prayer. I learned how to intercede, things that are the very framework of who I am today. And so he and we built businesses, we had properties, we were striving in those areas, but we were failing in our marriage. He was fighting his own past demons, and that put so much strain on the relationship and our marriage. And I wasn't mature enough to navigate that level of trauma that he was dealing with, but I fought for the marriage for about 3 additional years before God finally released me from it. When God told me he was releasing me from my marriage, although it felt like a relief, I also felt like such a failure. And I struggle with the scripture that talks about God hating divorce. And that's in, I believe, Mark 10 and 5. But I was in my prayer closet when God released me from this marriage. And it was pretty distinct that I was hearing his voice, but I struggled with that verse. And the enemy brought in doubt to, am I really hearing from God? It made me feel like I was being rebellious. But it was actually God that was telling me this. And he was like, I'm releasing you from this. So I go to my spiritual mom who worked at my church at the time. And I said, Mom, I need to talk to you about what I'm going through. I met with her, and in that conversation, I experienced a level of grace that I had never experienced before, because I was so used to hearing about the judgment and the sin and that I would go to hell and all the condemnation that came with messing up and making mistakes and divorce, and it was just so heavy for me. I remember her saying to me, God may not like divorce, but he's a God of love and he's a God of forgiveness. If you're saying that God told you that he's releasing you from this marriage and you feel that release, go with it. It was like a sigh of relief, because I was still learning to hear from God and knowing what his voice sounds like. And I needed to hear from someone that I knew had maturity in their relationship with God, and they weren't going to just tell me what I wanted to hear. I knew she heard God's voice, and I knew she was going to give me good counsel and godly counsel. And it just helped me to be clear on the decision, and it actually gave me peace. So that ended. I lost my marriage, my businesses, except I was still a stylist, and I had to give up multiple properties all in the same year. I had to file bankruptcy shortly after. A very, very difficult experience to have. And though I was solid in the decision, I was also angry with God, because I didn't understand why, even when I thought I was doing everything right, I still lost everything. I'm starting from scratch all over again. And that trauma kept me stuck for about 4 years. I couldn't see beyond it, because everything I had worked so hard for was gone just like that. But I was certain that God didn't want me in that relationship. So I'm like, I'm just going to go with it. It was just toxic and narcissistic. And I just knew that there's no way that a God that loves me will want to see me stay in that type of misery. In that fight, I fought so long for that, and it was just going nowhere. We kept hitting the same wall. There was no progress. And again, God was showing me how his grace works. So my divorce was finalized in 2010. So now fast forward to, I believe it was 2014. And my life finally starts to get back on track. My salon business is flourishing. I'm also partnered in another business, but I still didn't feel like I was any closer to my life's purpose. I felt like I was going in circles. And so forward to 2017, I'm in a reconnected relationship, but it's a long distance relationship at this time. And neither of us wanted it to stay this way. And so he lived in Arizona. And I was ready for a change. And so I tell my spiritual mom, and by her advice, she was like, hey, tell leadership that you're relocating. So I go to my pastors and I let them know that I'm relocating. I wrote the letter and dropped it off to church. I want to say it may have been a Tuesday before the final Sunday that I was at church. And for the first time, literally 13 years, my pastor called me up and there was a prophetic word being spoken over my life. And what she told me was, this is a God move and this is a fresh start in my journey with God. And that it was. There was lots of bumps and bruises along the way. That relationship ended a few months after I got there, and the details of how God carried me through that process has to go into another video. It's just too lengthy to talk about. But basically, when that relationship ended, I had a decision to make, and something in the depths of my spirit made it so clear that if I had gone back to Florida, I would have missed out on the opportunity to experience the biggest growth spurt of my spiritual journey. And this is when the rubber met the road for me, and God really started to teach me about his grace and how he picks us up in our lowest moments and lowest points if we allow him to. And this journey was painful, but it was so worth it. it. It was so worth it. It was painful because I had to deal with past traumas and allow healing to take place. God showed me things about my character that I needed to grow out of. I learned how to be myself again and not what the church pressured me to be. And so I sat in that discomfort because I knew that if I didn't, I wouldn't have grown the way that I have. And I don't know when that opportunity would have come around again for God to take me in such a place of consecration. And that's like a separation, right? Because I wasn't around any of my family members. I was literally in Arizona by myself on this journey with God. I said, God, I'm done trying to do things on my own. If you're not in it, I don't want it. And so when difficult times come, I'm reminded that he's doing a transformation in me, in my character, in my desires, in all that I'm doing and believing him for. And it's just me believing and yielding to this process. So if you're new to this journey with God, or if you're on a journey and you're just constantly feeling discouraged and condemned and you can't get it right, every time you mess up, I'm encouraging you to become a student of grace so you can really get to know the character of God and how much he actually loves us and wants to help us to be the best version of ourselves. You know, many of us were taught that God is a punisher, but I'm telling you that that was him functioning in the Old Testament, that old agreement. And in this new agreement, he operates as our Father. He's filled with love and mercy for us. And that's not to say that it's all peaches and cream and you're not going to have challenges. But when your dependence is on God for your faith walk and not on what you are doing or not doing, transformation begins to take place. So if you found value in this content, please comment below and let me know what part spoke to you the most. Hit that like button for me and subscribe if you feel led to. If while you were listening to this video, you thought of someone you think could benefit from what I shared here, please share it. We're here to lift each other up and encourage each other, especially in these days and time where so much is happening. Things are out of whack and we don't know what is going to come next. So share with people, help people on their journey with God. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.